Marcus Ellington had spent his entire life proving that assumptions were the cheapest lies people could afford. Growing up in one of the toughest neighborhoods in Atlanta, he watched people decide his future before they ever learned his name. Teachers expected him to fail, strangers assumed he would become another statistic, and wealthy executives smiled politely while secretly believing he could never belong in their world. None of them knew that every insult became another brick in the foundation of his determination. By the age of 34, Marcus had quietly built a private investment company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He never chased magazine covers or television interviews, preferring anonymous business deals over public attention. His greatest strength was remaining invisible while everyone else underestimated him. Even his closest friends knew only a fraction of his wealth, because Marcus believed money attracted admiration for all the wrong reasons. The only person he trusted completely was Emily Carter, the woman he had fallen in love with 2 years earlier. Emily had met him at a charity event where he volunteered without cameras or reporters. She believed he worked as a financial consultant and never asked about expensive cars or luxury houses, because she cared more about kindness than appearances. Marcus admired that about her more than anything. When he proposed, she cried before saying yes, promising that no amount of family pressure would ever change how she felt about him. Marcus smiled, believing love could overcome every obstacle. He had no idea that her family would soon test that belief in ways neither of them could imagine. Emily came from one of the oldest wealthy families in Georgia. Her father, Richard Carter, served as chairman of Carter Industries, a manufacturing empire that had dominated the region for decades. Her mother, Victoria, measured every person's value by the number of zeros in their bank account. Her older brother, Daniel, believed the family name alone made him superior to everyone else. When Emily announced her engagement, the Carters immediately demanded to meet Marcus. Emily warned him that her parents could be judgmental, but Marcus only laughed and told her people often revealed more about themselves than about others. On the evening of the family dinner, Marcus deliberately drove his old pickup truck instead of any of the luxury vehicles registered under one of his holding companies. He wore a simple navy suit without designer labels, an ordinary watch, and polished shoes that looked expensive only to those who appreciated craftsmanship. As he walked toward the enormous Carter estate, servants glanced at each other after seeing his truck parked beside imported sports cars. Inside the mansion, conversations slowed the moment Marcus entered the room. Victoria forced a smile that disappeared almost instantly after looking him up, and Richard barely stood from his chair before returning to his drink. Daniel whispered something to his wife, who covered her mouth to hide a laugh. Marcus greeted everyone with confidence, but the room responded with cold politeness that felt carefully rehearsed. During dinner, the questions began. Richard asked where Marcus went to college, then interrupted before hearing the full answer. Victoria wanted to know how much a financial consultant could possibly earn. Daniel joked that maybe Marcus would finally learn what real success looked like after marrying into their family. Every comment carried the same hidden message: "You are not one of us." Emily repeatedly defended Marcus, but every defense only encouraged her family to push harder. Marcus remained calm, answering each insult with quiet dignity instead of anger. That composure irritated Daniel more than any argument could have. Near the end of the evening, Victoria placed her wine glass on the table and smiled with fake warmth before saying that love was wonderful, but marriages between different worlds rarely survived. Richard nodded before adding that men without significant assets often became burdens on successful families. The room fell silent as every eye turned toward Marcus. He simply smiled, thanked them for their honesty, and replied that appearances had ruined more families than poverty ever had. Daniel laughed loudly and declared that if Marcus ever understood real business, perhaps they could have a serious conversation. Marcus stood, shook everyone's hand, wished them a pleasant evening, and walked out without another word. As he drove away beneath the city lights, his phone vibrated with an encrypted message from his chief legal officer. The message contained only one sentence. "The acquisition is complete. Effective tomorrow morning, you officially own 51% of Carter Industries." Marcus barely slept that night, not because he was angry, but because he understood exactly how dangerous the next morning would become. For years he had quietly accumulated shares of Carter Industries through holding companies, private trusts, and investment partnerships that never revealed his name. He had not targeted the company out of revenge. The acquisition began months before he met Emily, after his analysts discovered that Carter Industries was suffering from hidden debt, declining contracts, and questionable financial decisions made by Daniel. Marcus saw a valuable company being slowly destroyed by incompetent leadership. He bought shares because he believed he could save it, not because he wanted to embarrass anyone. But fate had created a far more complicated situation. At 6:30 in the morning, his legal team confirmed that the final transfer had cleared. Marcus Ellington now controlled 51% of Carter Industries and held the authority to replace the board, remove executives, and restructure the entire company. He stared at the message for a long moment before calling Emily. She answered immediately, her voice tense from the argument she had with her family after he left. She apologized for their behavior, insisted they were wrong, and begged him not to let one terrible dinner ruin their engagement. Marcus listened quietly, then asked if they could meet before work. When Emily arrived at his apartment, she looked exhausted. She expected him to complain about her parents. Instead, he handed her a folder containing acquisition documents, shareholder agreements, and a press release scheduled for noon. Emily read the first page, then looked up in confusion. By the third page, her hands began to shake. By the fifth page, she was staring at him in complete disbelief. Marcus explained everything calmly: the investment firms, the share purchases, the debt analysis, the board negotiations, and the final controlling stake that became official that morning. Emily sat in silence for nearly a minute before whispering that her father was going to lose his mind. Marcus admitted that was probably true, but he insisted he never hid his success to manipulate her. He hid it because he wanted at least one relationship that was not based on money. Emily believed him, yet fear filled her eyes. She knew her family. She knew Daniel would see this as a declaration of war. At 9 o'clock, the executive floor of Carter Industries erupted into chaos. Richard Carter arrived expecting an ordinary board meeting and discovered that emergency notices had been sent to every director. Lawyers were already waiting in the conference room. Daniel stormed through the hallway demanding answers while assistants avoided eye contact. Then the company's secretary announced that the new majority shareholder had requested immediate attendance. The door opened. Marcus walked in wearing the same simple style that had seemed so unimpressive the night before. Richard froze. Victoria, who had insisted on attending after hearing rumors, nearly dropped her handbag. Daniel laughed at first, assuming it was some kind of joke, until the lead attorney placed certified ownership documents on the table. The laughter stopped. Marcus thanked everyone for coming and spoke with the same calm tone he used at dinner. He explained that he now held a controlling interest in the company, that the acquisition complied with all regulations, and that he intended to protect the business from further financial decline. Richard demanded to know how long this had been planned. Marcus answered truthfully, long before he met Emily. Daniel accused him of infiltrating the family to steal the company. Marcus replied that if he wanted to steal it, he would not have paid billions of dollars for the shares. The room grew hotter with every sentence. Then Marcus revealed the information that changed everything. His forensic accountants had uncovered evidence that millions of dollars had been routed through shell vendors connected to Daniel. Several contracts appeared inflated, and internal reports suggested executives had concealed losses from shareholders. Daniel turned pale. Richard stared at his son in shock. Victoria immediately insisted there must be a misunderstanding. Marcus slid another folder across the table. Inside were bank records, invoices, and emails that his legal team had already prepared for regulators if necessary. Silence filled the room. For the first time since Marcus entered their lives, nobody underestimated him. Richard looked 20 years older as he asked whether criminal charges were coming. Marcus said that depended on the results of an independent investigation. He was not interested in humiliation. He was interested in truth. Then he announced his first official decision as majority owner. Effective immediately, Daniel Carter was suspended from all executive duties pending investigation. Daniel exploded, shouting that Marcus was destroying the family. Security quietly stepped closer to the door. Emily, who had arrived moments earlier after receiving frantic calls from her mother, stood frozen as her brother pointed at Marcus and accused him of orchestrating everything. Marcus looked directly at him and said the simplest sentence in the room. "I did not destroy this company. I arrived before you finished destroying it yourself." Daniel lunged across the table, but security stopped him before he reached Marcus. As guards escorted him out, he shouted one final warning that echoed through the conference room. "If you think this is over, you have no idea what my father has been hiding." The room fell silent again, because the fear that appeared on Richard Carter's face was far worse than Daniel's anger. Emily could not stop staring at her father. Daniel's final words echoed through the silent boardroom long after security had forced him into the elevator. Richard Carter looked nothing like the confident businessman who had built one of the most respected manufacturing companies in Georgia. His face had turned pale. His hands trembled slightly, and for the first time Marcus realized the older man was not afraid of losing money. He was afraid that a secret buried years ago had finally begun to surface. Marcus dismissed the emergency meeting earlier than expected, instructing the remaining board members to continue normal operations, while an independent auditing firm gained unrestricted access to every financial record the company had produced during the past 15 years. The directors quietly agreed. Many of them had privately questioned Daniel's decisions for years, but none possessed enough voting power to challenge the Carter family. Now the balance of power had shifted overnight. As employees watched Marcus walk through the executive floor, whispers spread faster than official announcements. The mysterious investor who had quietly acquired the company was the same man Daniel had mocked less than 24 hours earlier at a family dinner. Receptionists exchanged stunned glances. Managers hurried to verify the news on their phones, and longtime employees wondered whether the company had just been rescued or thrown into even greater chaos. Marcus ignored the attention. He entered the chairman's office, looked around the luxurious room that now legally belonged to him, and chose not to sit behind Richard's massive desk. Instead, he remained standing beside the windows overlooking downtown Atlanta. Success had never been about expensive furniture or impressive titles. It had always been about responsibility. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Emily stepped inside, closing the door behind her. Her eyes were red from holding back tears, but her voice remained steady. She asked Marcus one question that had haunted her since the board meeting ended. "Did you already know my family was involved when you bought the company?" Marcus answered without hesitation, "No." He explained that Carter Industries had first appeared on his firm's investment list nearly 2 years earlier, because its market value had fallen far below its true potential. Analysts discovered hidden strengths buried beneath poor leadership, and Marcus began purchasing shares through several investment vehicles to avoid driving up the stock price. Months later, he met Emily at a charity fundraiser. The connection between her and Carter Industries had shocked him, but by then the acquisition strategy was already too advanced to reverse without enormous financial losses. Emily believed every word. She also realized something even more painful. If her parents had treated Marcus with basic respect the previous evening, they might have learned the truth before humiliating themselves. Instead, their prejudice had blinded them. Before either of them could continue, Marcus received a call from the lead forensic accountant. Another discovery had just been made. Millions of dollars had disappeared through shell companies, but the signatures authorizing the transfers did not belong to Daniel alone. A second executive had approved nearly every suspicious payment. Marcus immediately requested the files be brought to his office. Less than an hour later, thick folders covered the conference table. Every transaction pointed toward one surprising name: Thomas Reynolds, the company's longtime chief financial officer. Thomas had worked beside Richard for almost 20 years. He was considered loyal, meticulous, and completely trustworthy. Yet the financial records painted a different picture. Offshore accounts, fake consulting contracts, inflated supplier invoices, and hidden commissions stretched back nearly 8 years. Marcus studied every page before asking investigators a simple question: did Richard know? No one could answer with certainty. Some evidence suggested the chairman had been deliberately misled. Other documents hinted he might have approved certain decisions without reading the details. The distinction would determine whether Richard had been negligent or criminally responsible. Meanwhile, Daniel sat inside a private law office across the city, furious and desperate. His attorney warned him that if the forensic investigation continued unchecked, prosecutors could become involved within weeks. Daniel insisted someone had framed him. His lawyer remained unconvinced. Then Daniel received an unexpected phone call from Thomas Reynolds. The older executive sounded nervous but strangely confident. He claimed Marcus was investigating the wrong people and promised he possessed information capable of destroying the new owner before the audit reached its conclusion. Daniel agreed to meet him that evening in an abandoned warehouse the company once used for storage. Neither man realized a private investigator hired by Marcus had already begun following every move they made after leaving headquarters. As sunset painted the Atlanta skyline in shades of orange and gold, Marcus stood alone in his office reviewing photographs of Carter Industries from its earliest years. One image caught his attention. It showed Richard standing beside a much younger Thomas Reynolds and another man whose face had been partially torn from the picture. Marcus asked his assistant to identify the missing person. Minutes later, she returned with an unsettling answer. There was no official record that the photograph had ever existed, and no employee by that name appeared anywhere in the company's history. It was as though someone had deliberately erased an entire chapter from Carter Industries. Marcus looked once more at Daniel's warning from earlier that day. If you think this is over, you have no idea what my father has been hiding. For the first time since taking control of the company, Marcus began to wonder whether Daniel had been protecting himself, or whether he had unknowingly opened the door to a secret far more dangerous than financial. Marcus spent the entire night reviewing every document his investigators had collected, but no financial report fascinated him as much as the damaged photograph he had found inside the company archives. Every successful business left a trail of paperwork, yet it was almost impossible to erase a person's existence completely. Someone had spent years removing files, deleting employee records, and even destroying photographs. That level of effort meant the missing man had once been extremely important. Early the next morning, Marcus instructed his private intelligence team to ignore the financial investigation for several hours and focus entirely on identifying the unknown face. Meanwhile, the independent auditors continued examining thousands of contracts inside Carter Industries. Employees who had once feared speaking against Daniel suddenly began volunteering information. Anonymous emails flooded the investigation office. Former managers described unusual meetings that always happened after normal business hours. Retired accountants admitted they had questioned suspicious invoices years earlier, but were pressured into remaining silent. Every new statement strengthened Marcus's belief that the corruption inside the company had lasted far longer than anyone imagined. Emily arrived at headquarters carrying breakfast for Marcus, hoping he had finally taken a break. Instead, she found him surrounded by files and photographs spread across the conference table. She gently reminded him that he had barely eaten since becoming majority owner. Marcus smiled and accepted the coffee, but his attention remained fixed on the torn photograph. Emily looked at it for only a few seconds before her expression changed. She quietly admitted she recognized the missing man. Marcus immediately looked up. Emily explained that when she was very young, she remembered seeing the same man visiting their house several times. Her father always introduced him as Uncle Samuel, even though they were not actually related. Then, one day, Samuel simply disappeared. Whenever Emily asked about him, both of her parents refused to answer. After a few years, it became an unwritten rule that nobody in the family ever mentioned his name again. Marcus felt the first real breakthrough had finally arrived. Before he could ask another question, his chief investigator called with urgent news. Surveillance officers had followed Thomas Reynolds the previous evening exactly as instructed. Thomas had secretly met Daniel inside an abandoned warehouse outside the city. Hidden cameras captured the entire meeting. Marcus immediately requested the footage. Minutes later, the video began playing on the large screen inside his office. Daniel looked frightened rather than confident. Thomas repeatedly assured him that everything could still be controlled if Richard remained silent. Then one sentence changed everything. Thomas said the company never belonged to Richard in the first place. Marcus replayed the recording 3 times to make sure he had heard correctly. Emily covered her mouth in disbelief. If Thomas was telling the truth, the entire history of Carter Industries had been built on a lie. Before they could process the revelation, another investigator rushed into the room, carrying a sealed envelope discovered in an off-site storage facility. Inside was the original incorporation agreement signed more than 30 years earlier. The founding document listed 3 equal partners: Richard Carter, Thomas Reynolds, and Samuel Brooks. Marcus immediately recognized the last name. Samuel Brooks was the missing man from the torn photograph. Yet according to every public record, Carter Industries had always been founded solely by Richard Carter. Someone had rewritten history. Marcus ordered his legal department to verify every signature. Less than an hour later, handwriting experts confirmed the documents were authentic. Samuel Brooks had legally owned 1/3 of the company before disappearing from every official record. Emily struggled to understand why her father would erase his closest business partner from history. She insisted Richard could be arrogant, but he was never cruel without reason. Marcus agreed that the story still lacked an explanation. Just then, Richard requested a private meeting. He arrived looking exhausted, carrying a worn leather briefcase that appeared decades old. Without saying a word, he placed it on Marcus's desk and slowly opened it. Inside were old letters, faded newspaper clippings, and dozens of photographs showing Richard Thomas and Samuel building the company together from a tiny warehouse. Richard looked directly at Marcus before admitting that everything Thomas had said was technically true. Carter Industries had never been his company alone. Samuel Brooks had been his closest friend, his business partner, and the man responsible for inventing the manufacturing process that made the company successful. Then Richard's voice began to shake. 23 years earlier, Samuel disappeared after accusing someone inside the company of stealing millions of dollars. The police searched for months, but never found his body or any evidence proving what happened. Thomas convinced everyone that Samuel had abandoned the business and escaped with company money. Richard believed him because every piece of evidence pointed in that direction. Consumed by anger and betrayal, Richard approved legal changes removing Samuel's ownership from the company. He spent the next 2 decades convincing himself he had done the right thing. Marcus listened carefully without interrupting. When Richard had finally finished speaking, Marcus asked the one question that mattered most. If Samuel stole the money, why did someone spend 20 years destroying every photograph and document connected to him? Richard lowered his head and remained silent. The answer never came because at that exact moment Marcus's phone rang. It was the lead investigator. A construction crew renovating an abandoned property on land once owned by Carter Industries had just discovered human remains buried beneath the old concrete floor. Alongside the remains was a rusted metal watch engraved with two simple words, Samuel Brooks. The call left the entire office in stunned silence. Richard gripped the edge of the chair as though the strength had disappeared from his body. Emily stared at her father, searching his face for any sign that he already knew what the investigators had found, but all she saw was disbelief mixed with guilt. Marcus immediately instructed his legal team to notify the authorities and preserve the construction site until forensic specialists completed their work. Within an hour, police officers had surrounded the abandoned property. Reporters began gathering behind the barricades, and television helicopters circled above the area as breaking news spread across Atlanta. Carter Industries was once again dominating the headlines, but this time it had nothing to do with business. Employees across the company stopped working to watch the live broadcasts. Some whispered that the missing founder had finally been found. Others feared the company would never recover from another scandal. Marcus ignored the cameras and drove directly to the scene with Emily and Richard. The atmosphere felt heavy as detectives carefully examined the remains. A forensic expert confirmed that the engraved watch had been buried with the victim for many years, but no official identification could be made until DNA testing was completed. Marcus walked through the old warehouse, studying every corner with quiet concentration. The building had been scheduled for demolition several times, yet every project had mysteriously been delayed. That detail immediately caught his attention. Someone had wanted the site left untouched. Detective Laura Bennett approached Marcus and explained that preliminary evidence suggested the victim had suffered a severe head injury before being buried beneath freshly poured concrete. If the remains truly belonged to Samuel Brooks, this was no disappearance. It was almost certainly murder. Richard closed his eyes, unable to hide his emotions. For more than 20 years he had convinced himself that Samuel had betrayed him and fled with stolen money. Now the possibility that his closest friend had actually been murdered shattered everything he believed. Emily quietly held her father's hand for the first time in years. Marcus watched without saying a word. He still did not know whether Richard had been deceived or whether he had chosen to ignore the truth because it was more convenient. Back at headquarters, another surprise was waiting. Thomas Reynolds had vanished. His office was empty, his company laptop was missing, and security footage showed him leaving the building less than 30 minutes after learning about the discovery at the construction site. Marcus immediately ordered every account connected to Thomas to be frozen. His legal department also contacted federal authorities after discovering several recent attempts to transfer millions of dollars overseas. Daniel, meanwhile, remained under investigation, but even he seemed shocked when informed that Samuel's remains might have been found. During another interview with Marcus's investigators, Daniel admitted something he had hidden for years. 6 months earlier, Thomas had approached him with an unusual proposal. He claimed old company secrets could destroy the Carter family if they ever became public, and he needed Daniel's approval to quietly destroy several boxes of archived documents stored in an off-site warehouse. Daniel never asked what was inside, because Thomas had managed company records since before Daniel joined the business. Looking back, Daniel realized those boxes may have contained the last remaining evidence connected to Samuel Brooks. Marcus thanked Daniel for finally telling the truth, but warned him that cooperating now would not erase the financial crimes already uncovered. Daniel lowered his head, understanding that his future would ultimately be decided in court. Late that evening, Marcus received another call from Detective Bennett. DNA testing had been expedited using samples provided by one of Samuel's surviving relatives. The results confirmed the impossible. The remains belonged to Samuel Brooks. Marcus sat silently after ending the call. He knew this investigation had crossed a line from corporate fraud into homicide. Whoever killed Samuel had successfully hidden the crime for more than 2 decades. The person also possessed enough influence to erase company records, manipulate financial documents, and convince an entire city that one of its founders had simply disappeared. Emily entered the office and found Marcus looking out across the dark skyline. She asked him whether he regretted buying Carter Industries. Marcus slowly shook his head. He told her that companies could recover from financial losses, but families could never heal until the truth replaced the lies that divided them. Emily leaned against him in silence, hoping the worst had already been revealed. Neither of them noticed Richard standing alone outside the office door. He had overheard every word. With tears filling his eyes, he reached into the old leather briefcase and removed a sealed envelope he had hidden for 23 years. Across the front, written in Samuel's unmistakable handwriting, were 7 words that made Richard's hands begin to tremble. "Open only if something happens to me." Richard realized he had spent more than 2 decades too afraid to discover what his best friend had wanted him. Richard carried the sealed envelope into Marcus's office with slow, uncertain steps, his hands trembling so badly that Emily had to help him place it on the table. The room fell completely silent. The yellowed paper looked ordinary, yet everyone understood it might contain the answer to a mystery that had haunted the company for more than 2 decades. Richard admitted he had hidden the envelope inside his personal safe ever since Samuel disappeared. At the time, he had convinced himself opening it would only make the betrayal more painful because he truly believed Samuel had stolen company funds and abandoned everyone who trusted him. Every year he considered destroying it, but something always stopped him. Perhaps guilt, perhaps hope. Marcus carefully examined the old seal before asking Richard final time if he was certain he wanted to know the truth. Richard nodded without speaking. Marcus slowly opened the envelope and unfolded several handwritten pages. The first sentence immediately changed the mood inside the room. Samuel wrote that if anyone was reading the letter, it meant he had either disappeared or been killed before exposing the biggest crime in the company's history. Emily covered her mouth while Richard stared at the pages in disbelief. Marcus continued reading aloud. Samuel explained that he had discovered millions of dollars disappearing through fake suppliers years before anyone else noticed. At first, he believed the irregularities were simple accounting mistakes, but after investigating on his own, he realized someone inside the executive team had created an organized network that had been stealing from the company for years. Samuel confessed that he had gathered evidence in secret because he no longer trusted anyone except Richard. He planned to meet Richard on the evening he vanished, bringing every document necessary to expose the people responsible. He never arrived. Marcus turned to the next page. Samuel had written one name in capital letters, Thomas Reynolds. According to the letter, Thomas had manipulated company accounts long before becoming chief financial officer. Samuel had confronted him privately after uncovering several hidden bank transfers. Thomas denied everything, but Samuel noticed fear in his eyes rather than anger. That single conversation convinced Samuel his life was in danger. He warned Richard in the letter never to confront Thomas alone, because he believed Thomas was not acting by himself. Someone with greater authority had protected him for years. Richard sat frozen, unable to understand how he had ignored every warning sign. For 23 years he had blamed the wrong man while trusting the person Samuel feared most. Marcus continued reading until he reached the final page. Samuel apologized to Richard for keeping the investigation secret and begged him to protect his wife and young son if anything happened. The letter ended with one heartbreaking sentence. "If I disappear, promise me my son will one day know his father never betrayed his family." Emily looked toward her father as tears rolled down his face. Richard whispered that he never even knew Samuel had a son. Thomas had told everyone Samuel's wife left the country shortly after the disappearance. Marcus immediately instructed his investigators to locate every surviving member of Samuel's family. If the son was still alive, he deserved to know the truth. Before anyone could leave the room, Detective Laura Bennett called again. Officers had searched Thomas Reynolds' lakeside home after obtaining an emergency warrant. Thomas was gone, but they discovered shredded financial records inside a fireplace that had not burned completely. More importantly, hidden beneath loose floorboards, investigators recovered several boxes containing original company documents reported missing years earlier. Among them was a partnership agreement proving Samuel had never sold his ownership stake. Legally, his shares should have passed to his heirs after his death. Marcus quickly calculated what that meant. After decades of company growth, Samuel's ownership would now be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Richard closed his eyes in shame. Everything Samuel built had been taken from his family because of one terrible lie. At that exact moment, Marcus's security director rushed into the office with another urgent update. Thomas Reynolds had just withdrawn a large amount of cash from a small bank near the state border. Highway cameras captured him driving north in a black sedan registered under a false identity. Authorities believed he was attempting to flee the country before formal murder charges could be filed. Marcus immediately offered company resources to assist the investigation, including private aviation records and access to surveillance technology owned by his investment firm. Detective Bennett accepted without hesitation. Every minute mattered now. As police units spread across multiple states searching for Thomas, Marcus stood by the office window watching flashing news helicopters circle above the city. He sensed the truth was finally within reach, but years of experience had taught him that desperate people often made desperate decisions. His instincts proved correct less than 10 minutes later when Emily's phone rang from an unknown number. She answered cautiously, then her face lost all color. A calm, familiar voice spoke only one sentence before disconnecting. "Tell Marcus to stop looking for me, or the next body he finds will belong to someone he loves." Emily slowly lowered the phone, her hands shaking uncontrollably, because she recognized the voice immediately. It was Thomas Reynolds. Emily stood frozen for several seconds after the call ended, her phone slipping from her trembling fingers onto the polished floor. The silence inside Marcus's office became heavier than anyone could bear. Richard immediately demanded to know what Thomas had said, but Emily struggled to find her voice. When she finally repeated the threat, Marcus's expression remained calm, even though every instinct told him the investigation had entered its most dangerous stage. Thomas was no longer protecting himself with documents and lies. He was willing to use fear. Marcus picked up Emily's phone and handed it directly to his cybersecurity director, instructing him to trace every possible signal, recover deleted metadata, and coordinate with federal investigators. Within minutes, technicians confirmed what Marcus had expected. Thomas had used a disposable device activated for less than 2 minutes before being destroyed. It was a professional move, planned long before the phone call. Marcus quietly asked Emily to move into one of his secured properties until Thomas was captured. At first she refused, insisting she would not hide while an innocent man's killer remained free. Marcus gently reminded her that courage and recklessness were never the same thing. Emily finally agreed after Detective Laura Bennett assigned 2 officers to accompany her at all times. While security arrangements were being made, Marcus gathered his investigation team for an emergency briefing. Every known financial account connected to Thomas had been frozen, every airport had received his photograph, and border authorities had been alerted. Yet Marcus believed Thomas was not trying to leave the country. A man who had successfully hidden one murder for more than 20 years would never abandon the only evidence that could still protect him. Somewhere inside Atlanta there had to be one final secret, something valuable enough to risk everything. Hours later, Marcus's intuition was confirmed. A retired warehouse supervisor contacted the company after seeing Samuel's story on the evening news. The elderly man explained that years earlier Thomas had repeatedly insisted on keeping one abandoned storage building under company ownership, even though it generated no income. Every proposal to sell the property had been rejected personally by Thomas. Marcus immediately recognized the address. It was less than 3 miles from the warehouse where Samuel's remains had been discovered. Without wasting another minute, he joined Detective Bennett and several officers on their way to inspect the building. The structure looked forgotten by time. Broken windows, rusted loading doors, and weeds growing through cracked concrete suggested nobody had entered for years. Yet Marcus noticed something unusual before anyone else. Fresh tire tracks crossed the dusty entrance and disappeared behind the building. Someone had been there recently. Officers carefully entered through the front while Marcus and Detective Bennett walked around the rear of the warehouse. Hidden behind stacks of old shipping containers, they discovered a heavy steel door that did not appear on any official building plans. It had been installed long after the warehouse was constructed. A locksmith forced it open. Beyond the door stretched a narrow underground corridor leading to a reinforced room illuminated by emergency lights running on backup batteries. Inside were dozens of filing cabinets, computer servers, and shelves filled with financial records dating back more than 20 years. It was not simply a hiding place. It was Thomas Reynolds's private archive. Investigators immediately began securing the evidence while Marcus examined the nearest desk. There he found a framed family photograph turned face down. When he lifted it, his heartbeat slowed. The picture showed Thomas standing beside Richard Samuel and a young woman Marcus had never seen before. Written on the back were 5 words: "The truth belongs to Olivia." Detective Bennett searched the room for any identification matching the name, but found nothing. Instead, another officer called everyone toward a locked cabinet that had just been forced open. Inside were dozens of cassette tapes labeled with dates from 23 years earlier. Marcus selected the earliest recording and inserted it into an old player recovered from the same cabinet. Static filled the room before 2 familiar voices emerged. One belonged to Samuel, the other belonged to Thomas. Samuel could be heard accusing Thomas of stealing company money, but what happened next shocked everyone listening. A third voice entered the conversation. Calm, confident, and unmistakably familiar. Richard Carter. Emily immediately looked at her father in disbelief. Richard himself looked equally horrified as the recording continued. The voice ordered both men to stop arguing before the tape suddenly ended with a loud crash and complete silence. Richard repeatedly insisted he had no memory of the conversation, claiming the recording must have been edited or manipulated. Marcus wanted to believe him, yet the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. Before anyone could examine the remaining tapes, a loud explosion shook the entire warehouse. The lights instantly went out. Dust poured from the ceiling as alarms echoed through the underground corridor. Someone had detonated explosives near the main entrance. Officers drew their weapons while Detective Bennett ordered everyone to evacuate immediately. Thick smoke rapidly filled the passage, cutting visibility to only a few feet. Marcus grabbed the box containing the cassette tapes while helping Emily toward the exit. As they reached the final doorway, another explosion collapsed part of the tunnel behind them, trapping several investigators inside. Outside, flames consumed the front section of the warehouse. Firefighters rushed to control the blaze while police searched desperately for the person responsible. Marcus looked across the parking lot just in time to see a black SUV speeding away through the smoke. He could not identify the driver, but one thing caught his attention. The license plate belonged to a vehicle officially registered to Richard Carter, a car Richard insisted had been stolen nearly 6 months earlier. The fire burned for hours before investigators finally declared the warehouse safe enough to re-enter. By then, nearly half of the underground archive had been destroyed by smoke and water. Marcus stood beside Detective Laura Bennett, watching forensic teams carry out blackened boxes that only hours earlier might have contained the final pieces of Samuel Brooks's story. Fortunately, the box of cassette tapes Marcus had carried out survived the explosion. It immediately became the most important evidence in the entire investigation. Richard remained unusually quiet throughout the night. Every few minutes he replayed the same question in his mind. If his own voice truly appeared on those recordings, what had happened 23 years ago that he could no longer remember? Emily noticed her father's confusion seemed genuine, yet she also knew memories could never erase responsibility. Marcus refused to jump to conclusions. He had spent too many years investigating complex corporate fraud to believe the first explanation was always the correct one. Early the next morning, audio specialists began restoring the damaged tapes inside a forensic laboratory. Most recordings were incomplete, but one remained almost perfectly preserved. Everyone gathered around the speakers as the technician pressed play. Samuel's voice came first. He calmly explained that he had gathered enough financial evidence to expose Thomas Reynolds. Then Richard's voice answered, but it sounded very different from the short clip recovered in the warehouse. Richard repeatedly urged Samuel to contact the police instead of confronting Thomas alone. Samuel refused, insisting he wanted one final chance to convince Thomas to confess before innocent employees suffered even more. The conversation continued for several minutes before another sound interrupted them. A door opened. Heavy footsteps entered the room. Thomas's voice became louder, angrier, and increasingly desperate. He accused Samuel of destroying everything they had built together. Samuel replied that the company had already been destroyed the moment greed became more important than friendship. Then the recording captured something nobody expected. A fourth person entered the room. The voice belonged to a woman. She begged the men to stop arguing. Richard immediately recognized her. Olivia Grant. She had served as Carter Industries' legal advisor during its earliest years. Emily frowned in confusion because she had never heard that name before. Richard quietly admitted Olivia resigned suddenly shortly after Samuel disappeared. Thomas claimed she had moved overseas. Nobody questioned the story. The tape ended with shouting, furniture falling, and then complete silence before abruptly stopping. Detective Bennett immediately ordered investigators to locate Olivia Grant. If she was still alive, she might be the only eyewitness left. Hours later, Marcus's intelligence team produced an astonishing discovery. Olivia had never left the country. She had changed her name, moved to a small coastal town in South Carolina, and lived quietly for more than 2 decades under a different identity. Marcus and Detective Bennett flew there the same afternoon. When they arrived at her modest home, an elderly woman answered the door. The moment Marcus mentioned Samuel Brooks, tears filled her eyes before he could ask a single question. Olivia invited them inside without hesitation. She admitted she had spent 23 years expecting someone to come. She explained that Thomas threatened to destroy her family if she ever spoke about the night Samuel disappeared. Terrified and believing no one would believe her, she accepted a settlement, changed her identity, and disappeared. Marcus asked the question that mattered most. Did Richard Carter kill Samuel Brooks? Olivia looked directly at him and slowly shook her head. Richard never touched Samuel. Instead, she revealed the truth that had haunted her for decades. On the night of the confrontation, Richard tried to stop the argument and left briefly to call the police after Samuel refused to walk away. During those few minutes, Thomas attacked Samuel with a heavy metal tool kept inside the warehouse. By the time Richard returned, Samuel was already lying unconscious on the floor. Thomas convinced Richard that Samuel had fallen during the struggle. Richard wanted to call an ambulance immediately, but Thomas checked Samuel's pulse and falsely claimed he was already dead. Panicking, Thomas insisted Richard would be blamed because the police already knew about the heated dispute between the partners. Shocked and unable to think clearly, Richard allowed Thomas to take control of the situation. Olivia confessed that she watched Thomas arrange the scene, and later learned he secretly buried Samuel beneath fresh concrete after sending Richard away. Richard spent the next 23 years believing Samuel died in an accident caused by their argument. while Thomas quietly rewrote the company's history and destroyed every piece of evidence connecting himself to the murder. Marcus sat in silence as the truth finally came together. Richard had made terrible decisions, but he was not the killer. He had been manipulated by the man he trusted most. Before Detective Bennett could finish taking Olivia's statement, Marcus's phone rang. His security director sounded more alarmed than ever before. Thomas Reynolds had just broken into one of the company's closed manufacturing plants on the outskirts of Atlanta. Security cameras showed him carrying gasoline containers and several industrial explosives. Even worse, he was not alone. Daniel Carter had been seen entering the building less than 30 minutes earlier, and nobody had come back out. Marcus immediately realized the final confrontation had begun. Thomas no longer cared about escaping. He intended to destroy every remaining piece of evidence, and if Daniel was still inside, he might become the last victim of the man who had spent more than 20 years killing the... Marcus ended the call and immediately informed Detective Laura Bennett that every available unit needed to move toward the abandoned manufacturing plant without delay. Olivia insisted on accompanying them because she believed Thomas would never surrender peacefully once he realized the truth had finally caught up with him. Bennett refused to let her enter an active crime scene, but promised her statement would be protected and delivered directly to the prosecutors. Marcus boarded the company helicopter with Emily while tactical officers raced across the highway below. The flight lasted less than 20 minutes, yet it felt much longer as smoke became visible above the old industrial complex. The plant had been closed for years, leaving behind miles of empty production lines, dark warehouses, and rusted machinery. It was the perfect place for someone like Thomas to disappear. As the helicopter landed outside the security perimeter, Marcus noticed several company vehicles parked near the main entrance. One of them belonged to Daniel. There was no sign of movement inside the building. Fire crews waited outside because police believed explosives had been planted throughout the facility. Every second increased the risk of losing both evidence and lives. Detective Bennett organized 2 tactical teams, while Marcus studied the outdated blueprints of the plant. Years earlier, his investment firm had commissioned digital scans of every Carter Industries property during the acquisition process. Marcus quickly found something missing from the official police plans. Beneath the oldest production hall was a maintenance tunnel connecting every major section of the building. If Thomas knew about it, he could move anywhere inside without being seen. Bennett immediately redirected one team through the underground passage while Marcus and another group entered through the main floor. The air smelled of gasoline and dust. Broken windows allowed narrow beams of sunlight to cut through the darkness. As they advanced deeper into the plant, they discovered fuel containers placed beside structural support columns. Thomas had prepared the building carefully. This was never intended as a hiding place. It was a trap. Suddenly a loud voice echoed through the empty factory using the old public address system. Thomas calmly welcomed everyone by name, laughing as he thanked Marcus for uncovering a truth that should have remained buried forever. He admitted stealing money from the company for years and confessed to killing Samuel Brooks, but insisted none of it mattered anymore, because history would disappear together with the factory. Marcus ignored the insults and continued moving forward. He knew Thomas wanted to slow them down while the explosives counted toward detonation. Then another voice interrupted the speakers. Daniel shouted for help. The sound came from somewhere on the second floor. Officers rushed toward the staircase while bomb technicians began disconnecting visible detonators. Marcus reached the upper level first and found Daniel tied to a steel support beam. His face was bruised, and one of his wrists was bleeding from struggling against the restraints. Daniel admitted Thomas had lured him to the plant by claiming he possessed evidence proving Richard had murdered Samuel. Instead, Thomas knocked him unconscious and used him as bait. As officers freed Daniel, another explosion shook the opposite side of the building. Ceiling panels collapsed, filling the hallway with smoke. Thomas appeared briefly on an overhead walkway, smiling as flames spread below him. He shouted that everyone had always underestimated him because they believed accountants could never become monsters. Marcus stepped forward and urged Thomas to surrender, reminding him that Samuel's remains had been identified, Olivia had spoken to the police, and the financial records had survived. Thomas laughed again. He admitted that prison no longer frightened him because he had already lived with the truth for 23 years. What frightened him was becoming forgotten. He wanted the world to remember the man who outsmarted everyone. Marcus answered quietly that nobody would remember his intelligence, only his greed. The words struck Thomas harder than any accusation. His smile disappeared for the first time. He raised a remote detonator and warned everyone to stay back. At that exact moment, Richard Carter entered the factory against police orders. Emily screamed as her father walked directly toward Thomas without any protection. Richard looked exhausted but determined. He apologized to Samuel aloud, even though Samuel was no longer alive to hear it. Then he turned toward Thomas and admitted the greatest mistake of his life was trusting fear instead of friendship. Thomas's hand began to shake. For years he had controlled every situation through manipulation, but Richard's confession destroyed the last excuse he had hidden behind. He insisted everything he did was necessary because Samuel would have ruined them all. Richard slowly shook his head and replied that Samuel wanted to save the company, while Thomas wanted to own it. Those two things had never been the same. Thomas looked down at the detonator one final time. Before he could press the button, a single shot rang through the factory. A police marksman positioned outside the building struck the remote from Thomas's hand without hitting him. The detonator slid across the concrete floor as officers rushed forward. Thomas attempted to escape toward the burning production line, but slipped on the oil-covered surface. Within seconds he was surrounded, handcuffed, and forced to his knees. As firefighters extinguished the remaining flames, Thomas looked directly at Marcus and whispered one final sentence that left everyone standing in silence. "You still have not discovered the greatest secret Samuel died trying to protect." Thomas Reynolds was taken into custody under heavy police escort while firefighters secured the last remaining hotspots inside the manufacturing plant. Although the immediate danger had passed, Marcus could not stop thinking about Thomas's final words. After everything that had happened, another secret seemed almost impossible, yet Thomas had spoken with the confidence of a man who knew his final weapon was not a lie. Over the following weeks, prosecutors filed multiple charges against Thomas, including murder, fraud, money laundering, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. The evidence was overwhelming. Olivia Grant's testimony matched the restored recordings. The financial records recovered from the underground archive exposed decades of theft, and forensic experts confirmed that the injuries on Samuel Brooks's remains were consistent with the weapon investigators recovered from Thomas's hidden storage room. Daniel Carter also accepted responsibility for his financial crimes, admitting he had ignored obvious warning signs because he cared more about protecting his position than protecting the company. In exchange for his cooperation, he agreed to testify against Thomas and surrendered every asset obtained through fraudulent transactions. Richard Carter resigned as chairman during a special board meeting attended by employees from every department. Standing before hundreds of people, he admitted that his greatest failure was not losing control of the company. His greatest failure was allowing fear and pride to silence the questions he should have asked 23 years earlier. He publicly apologized to Samuel Brooks's family, to every employee whose trust had been broken, and to Marcus for judging him before knowing the man he truly was. There was not a single person in the room who failed to notice the sincerity in his voice. Marcus accepted the apology, but he reminded everyone that forgiveness never erased responsibility. It simply allowed honest people to move forward after accepting the truth. A month later, the court officially recognized Samuel Brooks as the rightful co-founder of Carter Industries. His ownership interest, together with decades of accumulated value, legally transferred to his only surviving child, David Brooks, a middle school history teacher living quietly in North Carolina. David had spent most of his life believing his father abandoned the family for money. When Marcus personally visited him with the court documents and Samuel's final letter, David broke down in tears. He said the inheritance meant far less than finally knowing his father had been an honorable man. Marcus promised him that Samuel's name would never again be erased from the company's history. At the next shareholders' meeting, the board unanimously approved changing the corporate headquarters entrance. A bronze monument was installed featuring the names of all three original founders, Richard Carter, Samuel Brooks, and Thomas Reynolds. After a brief silence, Marcus requested one final change. Thomas's name would remain on the monument, not as a tribute, but as a permanent reminder that greed could destroy even the strongest friendships if good people ignored the truth for too long. No one objected. Several months later, Carter Industries reported its strongest financial performance in more than a decade. Marcus restructured the company, invested in employee education, expanded manufacturing, and established the Samuel Brooks Scholarship Fund to support students from underserved communities who dreamed of becoming engineers and entrepreneurs. Richard volunteered his time mentoring young business owners, determined to spend the rest of his life repairing the damage his decisions had caused. Daniel accepted a reduced prison sentence after cooperating fully with investigators and later wrote public letters encouraging corporate transparency and ethical leadership. Emily continued working beside Marcus, and together they built not only a stronger company, but also a stronger family, one based on honesty instead of appearances. On a quiet autumn afternoon, Marcus and Emily visited Samuel's restored gravesite after the official memorial ceremony. Fresh flowers surrounded the headstone as former employees, friends, and strangers paid their respects. Marcus placed Samuel's original watch beside the grave for a brief moment, before handing it to David, explaining that it belonged with the family that had waited more than 2 decades for justice. As everyone prepared to leave, Richard remained behind alone. He looked at Samuel's name carved into the stone and whispered the apology he had carried inside his heart for 23 years. There was no audience, no cameras, and no reporters, only an old man finally telling the truth to the friend he had failed. Marcus quietly watched from a distance before turning toward Emily. She smiled and asked whether he believed justice had finally been served. Marcus looked across the peaceful cemetery before answering that justice was never about revenge. Justice was giving the truth enough time to find the people who deserved it. As they walked away together, the sun broke through the clouds, casting light across Samuel Brooks's headstone. And for the first time in more than 2 decades, the story of Carter Industries belonged not to the man who buried the truth, but to the people who had the courage to uncover